Welcome to The Choice. In this episode, Following the Founders, a suit against the state. I don't think I'm influential, but if I am, then let's make use of it. This is Kurt Doolittle. This is a message I've put together out of recent frustration for law enforcement, the FBI, politicians, and other activists. It provides context for my efforts on behalf of my people, my country, civilization, and mankind. I realize that my work is rather overwhelming, sometimes impenetrable, although the world seems to do well with other philosophers. I don't know why mine should be any harder. And so I tend to get categorized in certain ways that are extremely unconstructive. But that said, I do have an ambition, and I do work within a frame. So I don't think I or we or people who follow me have much influence. I certainly spent a year and a half trying to turn the disenfranchised right into a political movement. But at least through 2018, the online dissident right, led by the conversion of conservative libertarians to what we consider the alt-right, was looking for solutions. The rest of the right was continuing their century and a half of defeat, so we thought we could give this dissident movement a positive political ambition rather than letting them continue imitating the left's strategy of agitation. But while we were using the right, in other words, making use of the right, they're the only available energetic conservative activists other than the Christians. Our solution actually benefits everyone. Well, everyone other than the globalists, the financial sector allies of the globalists, the state allies of the financial sector, and the academy and media that propagandize for the state, financial sector, and the globalists. All of them intentionally plotting and conspiring, or engaged in a conspiracy of common interests in their more than a century of warfare against the institutions of Western civilization, despite our having dragged mankind into prosperity and modernity. Now, we tested the political waters this past summer of 2020 by avoiding the left's tactics of baiting the right into hazard. They usually use a violence that they instigate, and using Alinsky's double standard technique. In other words, you think what the left is doing is merely random, but it's a well thought out strategic effort using their foot soldiers to create the pretense of a rebellion when it's really a very deliberate strategy to destroy Western civilization. They're not just protesting what they say they're protesting. They're engaged in a systematic undermining, or whether you want to think of it this way, their elites are using them to engage in the systematic undermining of Western civilization by means that they've planned, written about, and left open for all of us to see. But the online dissident right, which is a sort of combination of fundamentalists, white nationalists, and Nazis, canceled us. Doesn't mean that there aren't civic nationalists and ordinary conservatives and libertarians more like me, or traditionalists. I mean, it looks like the Republican Party tends to fall into that role, but the people who are activists for that side of the spectrum, they will tend to fall into the people who are more energetic, and that's Christians, nationalists, and the what you would call Nazis. They canceled us, so they demonstrated that the right's become the left, and it's just like I said it would. I said this in, I think it was 14 or 16, said if this kept going on, they'd just become the left, because they were using the left's tactics of social construction by undermining. Well, it's true that the right's strategy of trying to hold the moral high ground is true, but they failed to come up with a means of something to sell, because frankly there's nothing in the right to sell to the left. Now, you can't keep this hope that the left will learn. The right wing, in other words, high investment in behavior, norms, traditions, and commons, is really expensive, and the left is hyper-consumptive. They're experiential. So you're not going to be able to convert people whose instincts, whose very cognition is in polar opposite to you. So the right held out this hope that their left would convert, would learn, but they didn't, and they never have, and they never will. This is the big lie of the Enlightenment, that the the aristocracy was oppressive, and rather than domesticating the animal man, the barbarians, into people who were candidates for civic participation. So, like I said, the right had become the left by adopting the left strategy of undermining. There was no positive solution. They had nothing to sell. So our job was to come out with something to sell, something that made everyone happy. But again, they poisoned the well on us, and now they've made it impossible to conduct an adult discourse. They've poisoned the well for us to trying to turn them into a political force. They've poisoned the social media, which is the optimum platform for political organization. And they've made it impossible to put out an alternative position, policy, or program. They took the bait of the left, which is to position them as the violent ones. So the dissident right achieved exactly what the left baited them into achieving, their own failure. Now I can, and John Mark, take the blame. We can take the blame for, first it was thinking it was possible to unite the right. Second, for failing to explain our strategy of not taking the bait from the left. Launching a political movement where we thought we'd be free of Antifa's violence, in other words, Richmond, and showing live video for what was intended to be a soft launch among devoted followers, without recognizing that both the Christian and Nazi communities would attack any non-violent political activity in an attempt to, even though we're trying to prevent that civil war, because that's what they want. They want someone to be violent on their behalf. Frankly, they're too cowardly to do it themselves. So we're trying to prevent that civil war by creating a positive solution, a means by which the left and right can still cooperate, even if we have to politically separate at the social level. And in doing so, they're creating this, instead of avoiding that war, they're creating the necessity of it. Both sides are driving toward the necessity of it. I drew this beautiful little graph back in, it had to be 97 or 98, that said this is where it's going to go, and this is how it's going to go, and this is the time frame. And it's working out just as I said. So we failed just like everyone else has failed. And because we failed, I don't think we have any influence. Now, unfortunately, the FBI seems overly convinced that we do. I'm not sure why that is, but we'll walk through what we're up to so that you see if we have influence, then I'm going to try to make use of it. I'm going to try to make use of it by continuing to explain what's going on and explaining our solution. Because while you think that that a civil war might happen and that one side or the other might win, that's not what history says. There's never been a case in history of had mass migration of, quote, barbarians into an advanced Western civilization, or any civilization, that hasn't resulted in civilizational collapse, total war, or degeneracy from which they never recovered. So let's go through our plan. Our plan was non-aggression, not taking the bait, showing compassion or even love for the plight of the undeserved opposition. In other words, we don't look at BLM and Antifa as it's not correct to say that they aren't screwed. They are. This social and political order is just as disadvantageous for them as it is for the people on the right. These people are screwed. Why? Because everything's being extracted from them at all levels. The difference is nobody knows what to do about it because, frankly, it's a hard problem. So we wanted to use non-aggression, not taking the bait, show compassion of love, and then use the attention to spread the message and to stay on message. And in doing that, I gave a speech, and I just asked for 3 things in that speech. Limiting demonstrations to non-aggression. In other words, we can't let the aggression be bait into violence. That's what's happening, is the state is giving special permission to the left to use aggression and violence and looting. And they're doing it on purpose. They're specifically allowing it, but they're not allowing the right to have this same level of aggression and demonstration and looting and violence. This is a violation of not only simple intuition of fairness. It's a violation of natural law. It's a violation of the Constitution. It's a violation of common law. So, secondly, we want to have restoration of defamation by libel and slander, regardless of demonstrated cost. This was removed from the common law in order to make, under the pretense of the freedom of press, under the pretense that the press would continue the long history of reporting, meaning giving testimony in print, which they've entirely abandoned. That's why you look at Walter Cronkite or somebody from that era before. They're testifying. Their entire demeanor is testimony. Why? Because the West normalized, in other words, made an institution of public speech as testimony. So whether in church, in court, in church, or in public, we testified. That's what's different about Western civilization, where we force each other and we hold each other accountable for truth before face. We testify. That's what's unique. That's the secret of the uniqueness of Western civilization. So I wanted restoration of defamation, so that we can't have this continuous undermining, and we're forced into having some sort of rational discussion about policies and actions, not about people's character. And then lastly, to add political speech to protected speech and political identity to protected class. Why? Because religion isn't choosable, right? That's what the whole point is. Your sex isn't choosable. Well, it turns out that from an evolutionary standpoint, our political preference isn't choosable any longer, because in a bipartite system, when a two-party system like ours, it must always gravitate to the one set of classes against another set of classes. And in the present case, it's the masculine intertemporal bias of the conservatives and the short-term consumptive bias of and frankly dysgenic bias of the left. So, I mean, these things are genetic representations, so you can't claim they aren't subject to public speech. So the only way we can have a rational discussion about solving our present problem is by limiting non-aggression, so we can't get into it. In other words, there's no baiting for it. Restoring defamation, so that we have to have rational and truthful discussions, and making political and identity and political speech protected. It's the same way race and religion are, so that you can't be economically terminated for it. And that restores these demands to civic discourse, so we can do what the purpose of our long history of democracy, which is to make all, and especially our Constitution, which probably don't understand, is to make the public and informed and accountable for making their own rational decisions of self-determination. Probably overloaded that heavily, but that's what our Constitution is. That's the Western strategy. That's why the positive law doesn't work. It tries to bring about the Jewish idea of having priests, or the French idea of having public intellectuals rule the people and having them be unaccountable, versus the long history of Germanic and European military tradition, which is making the people make their own decisions so that they are themselves accountable for them. So you create a virtuous cycle of self-reinforcement. So the purpose of these three demands is just to make civic discourse on our political future possible, and to protect social media, entertainment, and politics from economic and social and personal threats, even physical threats, by the cancel culture. Because that's the purpose of cancel culture, is to prevent the resolution of differences by the negotiation of those differences into a settlement. That's what cancel culture is. It's an attempt to destroy the Western civilization's foundations. Now, I explained that historically Europeans were limited to competition in markets, disputes in courts, or resolutions of insults immediately in judicially sanctioned fighting or duel. Duel in our recent history, especially after gunpowder, has a different connotation. But throughout our common law history, because you're individually, you have the right to self-determination, you can choose to fight and go outside of the law and continue themselves. But in other words, you can't give up the insurance of the law, and you can move to direct dispute resolution. This is judicially sanctioned. This is when you see this comedy of errors that they say, I demand the right to trial by combat. That's what that means. It's that the state, no one has sovereignty over you. In the end, the sovereignty ends at the protection of you. In other words, if you wish to not take in the people or the court's choice, then you can step outside the law. You can become an outlaw, and you can handle it by nature. This is what it's for. And so again, European civilization is profoundly empirical throughout its entire history, and this sophistry is a recent innovation. So all of this continued the European tradition of open, truthful, transparent public conflict, debate, and resolution between sovereigns or juries of peers at every level. I mean, that's what it meant to move from a slave to a serf to a freeman, is you went from being unaccountable for your actions and the manner of being accountable to being accountable for your actions, but appealing to the manor court, and then going to the court of common law. You are gaining freedom you are gaining additional freedom by your demonstrated ability to conform to the common law. So that cancel culture has created a political weapon that violates the necessary function of open debate in a democracy. And it's taking advantage of 4 legal loopholes. Our prohibition on normative discipline, in other words, they've prevented us from forcing people to conform to high trust norms as if those norms are arbitrary. They're not. They're conformity with physical, natural, and evolutionary laws, so that we can have a high trust society that prohibits consumption of commons and forces maximum adaptation of the individual. Our prohibition on the duel, in other words, we can't not only publicly shame people any longer. I should tell you my story about that, because I almost got arrested for telling people not to behave in a restaurant like it's a barrio. Our prohibition on the duel, which is literally we can't fight any longer, except fighting is an extremely good way for men to negotiate their conflicts. And to then, because it's natural for men, we tend to have greater respect and treatment for each other after we fought than before. So we prohibit the duel. The duel, or the chance of fighting, made it much harder for you was an escalation of normative discipline. So if you didn't go to normative discipline, yet you insulted someone, then they could have a judicially sanctioned duel, which means basically a fight. And then next, we softened libel and slander. In other words, we eliminated the court prohibition on people's behavior, and then we gave the right of speech, not reciprocal truthful speech, so we licensed lying. So in 4 steps, we undermined the entire normative structure of Western continuous discipline, forcing domestic human animals, all of us which are super predators and vary a lot between each other, into this high trust population where we were acting in the common interest, producing commons at the personal, at the interpersonal, the normative, the social, the economic, and the political level. And these 4 loopholes are not trivial. Words do matter. They created the right, and in other words, those four legal loopholes generally allowed, in other words, they start with a freedom of speech, really. This freedom of speech, rather than truthful reciprocal speech, just create an opportunity for the left to do what it does, weaponize the female means of undermining. So I took a moment to remind the audience next that the only Europeans had converted testimonial speech in court and military speech when reporting into normative speech, and converted the behavior of the jury into the commons. Again, this is the singular reason for European civilization's unique tradition of truth before face in public, before the peers, the jury. And it's why we have the only high trust society on earth. Even the East Asians who stagnated, if you go to our closest peers are the Japanese and the South Koreans, they still practice face, which limits what they can do. So the authorities say we have influence. Well, I can't imagine it, because as far as I can tell, we've been canceled. But when they visit me, it's usually to ask if I know some or an individual group is a threat. Of course, they're really trying to see if I am or not. And I actually try to be helpful. I'm open in public in everything I do. I never touch organized violence, because that's the difference between activism and action. And that's the sort of legal line that's what's in the legal code. I can bring people together in mass. That mass can have a threatening disposition if it doesn't issue threats. But the point of bringing people to mass is to get attention so that we control the dialogue, so that we can actually have an honest, we can demand the reforms that will allow us to have a rational adult political conversation instead of descend into layers of lying, the left starting lying, the right copying the left, and now we're just degenerating into dishonesty on all counts, and the average person is angry because we're surrounded in an environment of commercial, financial, economic, political, and social and educational lies. I mean, everybody's exasperated. You wonder why things are escalating. So I'm not going to support any other action. In other words, I'm not going to support any other action other than the illusion that the action is possible. It'll only fail. It just fulfills the left's attempt to bait us into hazard that says we're the oppressors. The left wants to continue to construct this false narrative. So recently the FBI came to investigate me, or rather an FBI agent who knew what he was doing, which is unique. Got to remember the different FBI people are, I mean, in general, government people aren't very good at what they aren't very good compared to the private sector. But you know, the FBI is a pretty professional organization, and if you can get somebody who's got some experience, they'll actually know what they're doing, and they're pretty competent. You can have an adult conversation. So, you know, but they brought with him a Connecticut State Police detective that I guess is working for the FBI, and he was punching above his weight a bit. So indirectly, they threaten. One sentence, they say, we're not trying to press your freedom of speech, but they did threaten me. And from their conversation, I got to understand who had spent time with them, and etc. Hell hath no fury like psycho scorned. But we have but we get reported pretty regularly. We get reported pretty regularly because, of course, they're trying to say we're Nazis and whatever. But what we're really trying to do is bring about what the founders did. I don't know what this is from. This time it was because another group of followers who spun off last year were at the Capitol on the 6th. Apparently they have influence too. So I'd planned to go to the Capitol on the 6th, but once I stood it was a Proud Boys sponsored event, I decided it was likely to be ridiculous and disorganized. And secondly, I didn't want to step on another group's toes that we did in Richmond on July 4th, and then get people on the right mad at us again without reason. I could have brought a few people, I could have brought a couple of cameras, given my free speech again, and if I'd been there, I might have gone into the Capitol and given the speech there. That would have been something much more intelligent than this bunch of clowns breaking in and taking selfies. I mean, that was ridiculous. Now, it's nothing compared to what the left does. I mean, people forget that Hillary Clinton pardoned one of the top BLM people that run BLM today, and they bombed the Capitol building. You know, people don't bring that up. We're a threat. You know, the conservatives are basically high school football guys out out protesting because they're all too Christian to do anything else. So it would have been more intelligent than this. But that's an opportunity lost. And no, I don't consider the Capitol event meaningful. They were just rebelling against what they frankly justly felt, whether or not it's true, I don't know, a stolen election. Not when we were subject to a year of terrorism by BLM and Antifa and nothing at all was done. I mean, it's apparently perfectly legal or just to run roughshod over the middle class and people who run businesses and people who work for a living. And it's allowed to license basically a large number of criminals, drug addicts, and losers to come out and damage the society. But they did nothing. They did just the opposite. They assisted the movement. And heavily private organizations funded, and those private organizations have stated that their sole purpose is to destroy the United States and complete the Marxist project. Next, a week later, they visit my family and start threatening me through them, to the point where they're saying they're looking for any reason to arrest me, even if it's failing to recycle a can. So Soro and the Tifa and the leftists that have inserted themselves into BLM, and over 200 organizations are systematically trying to undermine our rule of law. They're burning our buildings, aggressing against citizens through random violence, tearing down our statues, immigrating us into dilution, and that's okay, and that's supported by the state. But me, I do research, I write and educate on the formal logic of natural law, which is really what our Constitution is built out of, except it's not formally stated, or what the vernacular incorrectly termed strict construction. And I specifically follow the same strategy of the founders, which is licensed in the Declaration and Preamble of the Constitution. But, I'm apparently more threatening. But so while I don't think I have or we have any influence at all, if we do have, I'm going to try to use it so that by explaining our strategy for everyone who hasn't been following me since the beginning, maybe we can make some traction. I'd worked early on in artificial intelligence and applied algorithmic law in the 80s. I started working on value neutral ethics and politics which is creating a formal logic or creating a value neutral language, right? So that we could talk about politics without this silly moralizing. I did it in response to the Democratic Party adopting the Alinsky tactic of just parroting talking points and not answering the interview's questions. In other words, polluting the informational commons. It bothered me that conservatives were just bumbling idiots and continue to be. Continuing the long-standing failure of pointlessly appealing to the ethics and morality that the left don't have as a means of arguing with them, as if ethics and morality were universal. The left's ethics and morality are hostile. Their idea is simple. It's just hyperconsumption and unregulated behavior. That's what it is. It's anti-adaptation. It's reversion. It's primitivism. So combating this technique is what made Fox News originally successful. They didn't allow people to just use talking points. But it really didn't stop the left's undermining civilization from within. They just move and adapt. And again, if you study them, what they do, they're just trying to destroy our institutions of cultural production from within, destroy our information system, destroy everything, destroy our knowledge, destroy our culture and our traditions. They're trying to destroy it from within so they can have this level of primitivism. So if we were to have value-neutral speech, right, it has to be truthful. That's what a value-neutral speech and truthful speech is what's necessary. That would create a system of measurement for ethics and politics. The law uses lists of criteria for legal judgments. And my work on morality, frankly, had been easy because so many people had worked on it before, turning it into a system of measurement, in other words, a formal logic. That wasn't that hard. But work on truth itself, in other words, turning truth into formal logic, led me to understand the problem of demarcating truthful speech and the legal criteria for doing so. In other words, if we want to suppress all this law, if we want to start with a value-neutral language, turn it into a law, and then be able to hold it up in court so it's not arbitrary, what we have to produce we have to produce a logic that the court can use consistently, a system of weights and measures. So that's what I did, is I produced a system of weights and measures for determining whether or not a truth claim was possible. And then that led me to understand how libertarians were lying. Once I understood the method that libertarians were using to lie, then how the left in general was lying. And once I understood how the left was lying, I could understand how the right was lying. And from there, I could complete that, not only the logic but of the social sciences, and I could actually create a logic of lying. So in other words, you can not only is it there is an underlying logic to truth, there's an underlying logic to lying. And so I've produced these spectrums of truth and lies, and I call it the grammars. It's a big chart, but it's as annoyingly precise as the periodic table of elements. I mean, it's really that accurate. So just as we can test chemical combinations, we can test verbal combinations. So, in other words, I just identifies everyone's lies and frauds and produced a method of exposing them as lies and fraud in court, and a checklist that courts can use to do it, and frankly, any ordinary person who gets a little skill can do it. Courts are extremely good at this. I know there's a lot of popular nonsense that our court system doesn't work. That's not really true. Our court and jury and legal system works pretty well. It's actually this underlying problem with the imprecision in the Constitution due to their original assumptions of the founders that, in other words, there's a lot more about rights and government, and they didn't put the details of the common law as natural law and its underlying logic in there with equal veracity. So we ended up with the Bill of Rights, but we didn't end up with the logic behind the Bill of Rights. My later work was on economics, because economics is one of the most effective methods of lying, given that most economics today is wishful thinking. It's actually an attempt to circumvent physical, natural, and evolutionary laws. And it's replaced morality, which is, and again, morality moral codes are an empirical measure of what is necessary within a group given their constraints. And it replaced empirical evidence as the justification for policy. In other words, we have a pseudoscientific policy structure because of economics becoming our method of policy determination. This was worse because it allowed us to circumvent our traditional morality and talk in terms of morality and its empirical origins. And so this pseudoscience was able to defeat the work faster than our tradition. We were able to rationalize and science our traditions. I work on cycles of lies, cycles of generations, business cycles, economic cycles, and institutional, demographic, and civilizational cycles. I had a pretty complete picture of the past 10,000 years and how our current crisis is a repetition of previous crises. And so while I suspected in the 1990s, I've been predicting a civil war since the early 2000s. I mean, it's out there in text. Now, when I first started blogging, I found as much pushback from the public on the prediction of the 92 failure of the Republican Party, the 2001 correction, the 2008 correction, the lost decade of the teens, as I did with the certainty of public upheaval and civil war and the possible world war between 19 and 24. I mean, it's not like this is some impulse I've drawn out of history. My predictions have been pretty spot on over time. Now, even by 2016, the commentariat was ridiculing me, but over the past few years, talk of civil war is an increasingly frequent opinion, observation, and prediction. So at this point, I'm just saying I was as prescient in determining the current condition as I was in the previous events. But until 16, I sort of avoided political discussion and stuck with strategy, politics, economics, and law, because politics tends to degenerate rather quickly into nonsense. But in 16, it was pretty clear that there would be a civil war if Clinton was elected, so I had to change my timeline. And frankly, this is the kind of work that can't be accelerated very easily. And today, you can see the stress escalating. I mean, there's recent shooting in Pennsylvania where people had an argument over snow. And if you follow the videos, in other words, the dominance of handheld cameras or phones is leading to capturing of all sorts of violence around the world. If you follow what's happening, you realize that while violence in general may be decreasing, the worst kind, in other words, the criminal violence and warfare violence, is the escalation of social violence. The social violence is increasing. So my strategy is consistent. Everything I do is calculated. It's methodical and deliberate. It's probably way more than you can imagine. If you have followed my work in the level of detail I put into my arguments, it's that literally painful for most people. That's because I build up from first causes. But everything I do is this same calculated, methodical, deliberate level. So I deliberately refer to violence because the libertarians converted conservative and moral obligation to use violence to ensure one another's sovereignty, to Enlightenment and Victorian appeal to man's best nature, thus undermining the first principle of Western civilization's insurance, that it's only through universal reciprocal insurance of our sovereignty and our demonstrated interests, which we call freedom and liberty, it's only through that it's possible. In other words, you can't defend with words. It's the only criteria under which the law, not men, are sovereign. And it's the only method by which man adapts to the laws of nature rather than seeking to evade them. And this is, again, the first cause of European success. Truth causing a discovery, adaptation, and application of the laws of the universe. Now, I'm deliberately adversarial because I'm drawing attention to the consequence of removing adversarialism from education, from civil behavior, and from civic life. And I want to restore that every man must be a sheriff if the gains of Western civilization are to be preserved and our evolution continued. Domestication of animal man isn't depression, it's training. I'm deliberately prosecutorial because I'm drawing attention to the consequence of the failure of philosophical and civil discourse by the presumption that the left is engaging in honest reciprocal discourse, that they're misled. They're not. Their strategy is just deceit and fraud from top to bottom. They're parasites. They're trying to avoid paying the costs of Western civilization, but they want to enjoy the hyper-consumptive benefits of it. I'm deliberately baiting moral conflict because it's only moral conflict that humans demonstrate their beliefs. You overcome the pseudoscience of survey testing and the behavioral sciences by asking people conflict questions. People are more honest in what they defend than in what they pretend, what they give the pretense of. I'm deliberately producing and teaching the formal logic of testimony and deceit, so the great problem of our age, the industrialization of lying, can be discussed in rational and scientific terms. Now, while our conflict is largely one of ignorance, the conservative right can't speak the truth because it's a post-war taboo, and the progressive left must lie because they're engaged in a vast social, political, and civilizational crime. I'm prosecuting taboos because those taboos, those things we most dislike to talk about, prevent truthful discourses on the first causes of our thousands of years of political conflict. In other words, taboos need to be talked about because they're the most evidence of what it is we're trying to lie about. I'm deliberately framing the discourse as true and false, and testifiable and untestifiable, and criminal or not criminal, because that three criteria exposes almost everyone's lying to conduct not just preference or advantage, but political crime. I'm deliberately researching and teaching by conducting King of the Hill games to demonstrate the necessity in competition of competition in teaching males. If we want men to invest in economy, society, policy, norms, traditions, and institutions, in other words, if we don't want them to check out and go play video games, not stay in shape, be unfit husbands, and not care about society at all, then we've got to provide them the incentive. Men learn incentive to care by competition the way females learn to care by non-conflict. I'm deliberately discussing civil war because I know for certain, without question, that it will occur, because I know with equal certainty that we won't be able to prevent it or its escalation into a world war without sufficient public certainty of the likelihood of that war and the consequences of that war. So I want to have that discussion. I want people to be aware of what that war would look like, what its consequences were, because it's only in that certainty of fear that we can drive people to have a debate over what is the only possible solution, which is we can either war or we can separate and go our separate ways, the way the original Constitution was actually laid out before the Civil War, and the way the 1,000 years of the Holy Roman Empire allowed a multitude of states. Each of us following our natural traditions and creating a market for polities that was most suitable to us. So to make that conversation rational requires a proposition that's, in other words, we need to have create the opportunity for a discussion. We need to understand the necessity of discussion, and then we need to have something to discuss. So in order to have something to discuss, and it's got to be concrete, we need a couple things. A moral license. They need a moral license to demand political change. Well, I don't need to supply that anymore. That's here. We need a set of demands. Moral men, particularly Christian men, need to offer a set of demands that satisfy the best majority, and that if that is refused, they now feel they have moral license for retaliation, justifying a revolt. A plan of transition. Moral men need to understand how to move from state A to state B because we all fear what we don't understand. But we can make each other understand that process. We can remove fear of it. We can make it accessible to people. People will less resist it. They'll begin to see the opportunities because those opportunities of decentralization and local adaptation are profound. That's the only way we're going to reverse. In other words, distribution of opportunity is the only way we're going to reverse distribution of opportunity to demographic groups in local regions that can customize their norms, traditions, and investments is the only way to reverse the centralization of capital in the state and the financial sector. You need a means of insurrection. In other words, you need the promise that we must have a solution, or we're going to have an insurrection. In other words, they have to believe that if this negotiation fails, that they have a mean to obtain it by force. In other words, you have to, in order to bring a solution into being, you have to make it the most desirable outcome. What their left does is they create chaos so that the undermining collapses to a natural, deterministic end, which is authoritarianism, because that's what they want. To make revolt, insurrection, or revolution, or the constitutional revolution, that's reform, legal and moral, requires imitating the founders' extra-political, extra-institutional, civic construction by civilians of a suit against the state for crimes by the state against some or all of its people. That's what the Federalist Papers and the Declaration consist of. A suit by a subset of people against the state where the people are the jury and the jury makes the decision. That's the Western civilization strategy. It's the reason why we can have English revolutions, yet nothing changes except the law. That's why we don't have these catastrophic revolutions other people have, because we still practice our traditional common law in this form. So that's the reason for the successful evolution of the English model for 1,000 years, and the Germanic model even longer, and the pre-Germanic or Proto-Germanic, or what we think of as the Greco-Roman model, even longer. Now, my work is a suit by the people against the state, and a constitution as the judgment of the court of the public against the state, consisting of the remedies demanded by the people, the plaintiffs, whether against the state or the state and its allies. As such, in imitation of the founders, I have conducted this discourse completely open in public for years. I've produced thousands of pages of my research program, just like the letters of the Revolutionary period. I've created and nearly completed an indictment of the state and its special interests. I've created a Declaration of Reformation, mirroring the Declaration of Independence. I've created a preamble that as the original preamble implied but left unstated. I've created a set of constitutional amendments that fix the 8 major failings of the original Constitution that have allowed its undermining by sophistry and artifice. And chief among these is explicitly defining natural law, reciprocity and testimony, the criteria for basic rights, and I enumerated those rights such that they're inviolable. There won't be any more discussion about how can we cheat this Constitution. I've created a proposed reorganization, a plan of transition from the present federal government back to the original pre-Civil War government of a federation of states on the ancestral European model, where the federal government is limited to emergency and defense, adjudication of conflicts between the states, and fulfilling the church's role as insurer of last resort, thereby restoring sovereignty to the states in matters of civic behavior, norm, traditions, and the institution of cultural production. I've created in other words, I'm trying to restore it so that this war on Western civilization can't continue. I've created a proposed set of policy changes that repair the damage to individual, familial, education, banking and finance, the economy, healthcare, the interior, and military strategy. Most of these policies are known. In other words, other than my economic work, most of this isn't terribly innovative. It's because it's out there in policy suggestions all the time. But because there's so many special interests, and because there's so much buying of interest, these reforms can't be brought to the floor for votes. And frankly, I've created a threat of what extreme policies might emerge if we war instead of settle. In other words, I've proposed what it would look like if we have a war and the right wins. And it's going to be a lot more severe than what it looks like if we actually settle. In other words, I'm trying to create this exhaustive picture so the people can be educated about what their choices are. That's why I've named this podcast The Choice. It's because we can't make a choice without knowing what to choose. So my work tries to restore the Constitution to its intentions of an alliance between states under a weak federation in the 1,000-year history of the Roman Empire, the successful German and English model of the rule of law, of the natural common law, of the independent judiciary and houses of government as markets for commons. In other words, I've tried to restore markets and everything. What I do is legal in the United States. I know I'm very careful about these things. What's illegal is planning, organizing, committing crimes. I have a long-standing policy of separating activism from action. I have a long-standing policy of stating that we can only act as one, not as individuals or small groups. That's all counterproductive because it lets the left succeed at baiting you into hazard rather than getting together as a political unit and using political force. The only way to avoid violence is to organize on a scale that the chance of violence by either side is untenable for both sides. In other words, this I learned in Ukraine very quickly, is that the state cannot act against you if you have the state, especially the American state, cannot maintain its legitimacy if it acts against you in response for moral demands. So I'm trying to make I want to make the chance of violence real and the knowledge of and the opportunity to do it untenable so that we must negotiate so we can settle this before it turns into a hot war. So if you have designs that conflict with the strategy, I don't want you to contact me regarding it. I don't want to know, and I consider it harmful. When we do ask people to show up, do show up. I don't care what side of the world you're on, whether left or right. Because frankly, this is a centrist position. I'm only trying to get the right to show up because the middle won't. So when we ask you to show up, do show up. Show up ready to play Gandhi until we have no choice. That is the only path to the moral high ground. There is no other. There's no matter how horrific you see the present injustices, crimes, no matter how you see this war of genocide and civil against our culture, our civilization, our people. The way we win is to demand the same protections for political identity that we do for religious, racial, and sex identity, and to have an honest discussion over the future and the policies. And then we will have to go our ways because it's genetic. Until we can't do that because they have the demonstrated criminality in open discourse. And if they demonstrate that criminality in open discourse, then it's over anyway, and we'll have failed. But at least we tried the right solution. At least we repeated the efforts of the founders. At least we sought an amenable solution that preserves the value of the United States on this continent, but eliminates the curse of its monopoly. So if you, the FBI, the police, the state, or any man living thinks I'm pursuing other than just and moral goals for my people, my country, mankind, and repetition of the founders, then you've got to find some reason that's not simply justifying your own lies, immorality, criminality. A criminality that by the founding documents themselves licenses the very revolution you're claiming you are justly preventing. Because everything I have done in every dimension is working for the sole purpose to restore truth and display word and deed in political discourse, and to restore reciprocity and proportionality of the Constitution, the law, government, and policy to a people who have suffered through 70 years or more of continuous lying and civilizational warfare by all parties. Parties that are abusing a population insufficiently educated to evaluate their false promises of the left, and that their utopia violates formal physical, natural, and evolutionary laws of the universe and can never, ever, under any circumstance succeed. It can only bring about the destruction of civilization in the modern world, as Islam has destroyed all civilizations of the ancient world. And our people have suffered through the unspoken truth of the right, that the European tradition and the reason for European excellence is one of systemic soft eugenics by the use of market forces in all walks of life and the suppression of reproduction of those unfit for them in the genetic pacification by hanging, war, or starvation of those who fail. The entirety of the left's program from Marx to the present is nothing but systemic hatred of and undermining European civilization for our discovery, adaptation to, and application of the laws of the universe, and claiming Europeans are oppressors rather than liberators from those laws by the use of those laws. The price of adherence to those laws and the benefits of doing so is the suppression of the reproduction of the unproduction in the strategic economic context and demographic context that exists. There is no escape from it any more than there is escape from natural selection. Genetic load accumulates. A population is no different from a body. It dies if it can't get rid of genetic error. I simply state this truth so that we know the cost and consequences of the political choices we make, or that we failed to make, by informed and rational choice. We have seen, contrary to the left's promise, that we would all come together. What we found in the most equalitarian societies that the sexes pursue their instincts even more so. That there's a natural conflict between the reproductive and therefore social and political instincts. And all of us are a blend of masculine and feminine instincts. And this is why there's an approximate split in the population by very statistically predictable means, this overlap of masculine and feminine traits. The masculine right chooses wisely for the long term. The feminine chooses wisely for the short term. The difference is that we are socially, economically, and politically incompatible because those differences. We are at least incompatible under democracy. And now we're wealthy enough because we're no longer constrained by agrarian production. We're no longer prohibited from pursuing those different strategies. In other words, in history, we were speciating. In other words, there was as great a difference between the many different regional human groups in the pre-agrarian world as there is today between Western Europeans and East Asians. That difference is quite great, but that difference was common across all groups. We were all speciating again, adapting to local circumstances. The agrarian revolution caused a rehybridization, and the European Age of Sail caused another rehybridization. And we took advantage of those hybridizations. The problem is that we've exhausted the technological advantage that comes from the advancements of Western civilization. In the absence of that luxury, we are all reverting to our natural evolutionary tendencies. And in the West, we have two groups, the left and the right, or at least two groups, that want to pursue very different objectives because they have different biological needs. In horrific terms, you probably can't tolerate, we're trying to speciate again, and our current conflict is a war of speciation. It's a very simple problem is that the agrarian homogeneity, in other words, the agrarian model could only increase its productivity by capturing additional territory. We're not in that circumstance anymore. The industrial age, you can only get it by more population, more resources. We're not in that age anymore. So the age we're in is one we can return to speciation. That's the actual struggle that's going on. That's the unconscious struggle that's causing our incentives. The left is just it's largely a Jewish thought leadership, just as Europeanism is generally a Germanic Christian thought leadership. So these feminine and masculine utopias are in conflict, and speciation or separation is useful. It may not be necessary to sever the federal government as an insurer of last resort, if you know what that means, but in order to keep the country homogenous in defense of all. But there's no reason we have to have social and normative identical groups. We can separate. What will happen, of course, is we'll each pay for our choices. So the only solution is separation by social, economic, and political means, even if we continue to share military and strategic common interests in a federal government, just like the past. So contrary to the left's false accusation of oppression and the right's false promise of the possibility of an aristocracy of everyone, meaning a majority middle-class society, the West domesticated itself over 5,000 years and discovered, innovated, and adapted faster than all civilizations can be combined because of it. And it was matched only by China, whose much slower pace finally stagnated in the late medieval period, just as Europeans came out of the supernatural dark ages of the Abrahamic religions. So all civilizations other than Europeans failed to maintain natural selection. And our traditions vary because of the West's success and the rest's failure. The left has spent since the 1850s inventing suicides, sophistry, deceit, and shouting down to deny Darwin's discovery of the reason for Western success, a truth the left simply can't bear, and virtue signals with lies that deny the laws of the universe as possible, a truth that the right cannot bear because it tries to virtue signal rather than fight as it always had to in order to preserve its advantages as a small population on the edge of Eurasia trying to isolate and maintain its rapid evolution. Since all of Western civilization, all our rights are derived from the right of self-determination by self-determined means, then none of us can deprive another of that right without licensing reciprocal warfare to equally deprive the other of the same right. So none of us can justify by any means that does not incentivize bloody warfare by the opposition the choice between the left's dysgenic, idealist utopia of hyper-consumptive experience, low investment in self, and parenting in endurable commons, and the right's eugenic, capitalizing continuous evolution by high investment in self and parenting in durable commons that reduce the cost of those heavy burdens. So the only solution is to separate or war. We can war and hope that one side or the other prevails at the expense of the others, or we can choose to separate and continue to run our different experiments and learn from each other from having done so. Now, I don't think I'm a bad person. I don't claim to be a good person whatsoever. I'm a ruthless entrepreneur, a good business partner, a decent employee, a questionable husband, and most likely a terrible father. My only virtue is that I'm innovative. I work very hard and I pursue my goals endlessly, even at the cost of my health, my well-being, my happiness, my marriage, my family, friends, and my wealth, which puts me in the same set of character traits as many similar thinkers in history who, alike discovered too late, were only fit for bachelorhood and the solitary hard work on our missions. So if you think my mission is evil, or if I'm immoral or treasonous or wrong, or doing other than devoting my adult life to the most moral act a man can, whether you're an individual, a bureaucracy, or a state, then frankly come at me. Make me the revolutionary you fear, instead of the philosopher solving the great problems of our age that I seek to be. I am, and I propose nothing different than did Jefferson in his less scientific prose. My strategy has always been that if I provide a solution, then leadership will emerge. I'm not interested in it, willing, or terribly fit for it. But if you try to make a revolutionary out of me and prosecute me, I'm not going to shirk from the duty. And if you think that after building these businesses, solving the great philosophical questions of the past century and a half, and engaging in activities you likely lack and can't obtain the security clearance to be aware of, that I can't, albeit with quite a bit of effort, bring a revolution into being if that was my choice, then you're not only questionably moral and vastly ignorant, but a dangerous fool, totally incognizant of recent world events. That kind of idiot only ensures that the daily escalation of arbitrary social violence continues, and we and all of the rest of us blindly stumble into bloodshed. So right now, I'm the only person, my ragtag group of libertarians are the only people that have anything resembling a solution that will prevent the future that is certainly to come. Because revolutions and civil wars are always suspect in prospect, but they're deterministic in retrospect. And those of us who understand history are doomed to suffer forever the ignorance of those who don't. I'm Kurt Doolittle. Thank you for listening.